Hi again. So writing up the trading profit and loss account. So in the last lesson we looked at how to calculate the profit and loss balance at the bottom of the trading profit and loss account. Now remember, you're working in reverse here. This is an incomplete record. So if you look at the wording on this, the first thing you were asked to do is to prepare with workings a statement, the balance sheet showing O'Higgins' profit or loss for the year ended. Now, it is most definitely the balance sheet and not a trading profit and loss account, all right? Even though it says you're trying to show the profit or loss, what they're referring to is figuring out this figure here. Our next thing is to write up the trading profit and loss account, and this is key here, in as much detail as possible. So we need to show as much as we can in that account. So we start off, and we're not going to know what our sales figure is first, and that's fine. We can leave that blank. So we know sales will come here. Then less cost of sales. So if you think about that, cost of sales, we know this from question 1. So we have our opening stock. That'll be found in the narrative at the start of the question. So let's go back and check. So if there is opening stock when we bought this business, it's going to go in there. So there we can see it, the 16,700. So transfer it in 16,700. If there's no opening stock, you just leave it blank. Then we have our purchases. We don't know what our purchases are because we don't have that figure yet. It's not like an incomplete A where we worked and got our sales and our purchases first. So we don't know what either of these figures are. So I'm just going to mark those in yellow for you, just so as you can see. We don't know what they are. We do know that there is a drawing though. So let's go and get that drawing figure. So back to your workings. So if you look here, the goods, the 5,200, that's our drawing. So we're marking that off and we're saying minus 5,200, and we get a total figure out here. Again, we don't know what that is yet. When we subtract it, we get what's known as cost of goods available for sale. Again, we don't need to label that. Less closing stock. So do we know what the closing stock figure is? Back to your workings. If you did an adjustment on it, it'll be in your workings here. Most likely you won't have any adjustment on it. The only thing you might have is a stock of heating oil that's been included in it. So let's look at the question, and you can see in that closing narrative your closing stock 17,200. So we're putting that in. So minus 17,200. That'll give us a cost of sales figure. Again, we don't know what it is yet. And leaves us with gross profit. Again, you don't know what that is. So it could be a gross profit or a gross loss, and that's absolutely fine. And you leave it as it is. Then you have your less expenses. Now, don't worry about analysing these. You don't have to analyse them into admin, selling and distribution, anything like that. You can just put them straight in. These are generally high mark workings. They're probably coming in about 6 or 7 marks each. So go back to your adjustments and you go down through it step by step. So our interest is the first one, 3375. Again, when you use it, just put a highlight on it or a line through it, whatever system you have. So 3375, and we call it interest. Then we have light and heat, 5820. Now I have it labelled admin, you don't need to do that. General expenses, so 95750. Our rates 10,500. Again, just marking it off so you know you're not missing anything at the end. And a quick look, there's nothing else there that needs to go in. The only other thing that might crop up there is when you have your charity payment. Okay, so if you haven't got it listed here, all right, you'd go and you check just was there anything for it. So in the question, and you're just having a look here to see. Now there mightn't be in this particular question. So light and heat, interest dealt with, wages dealt with, the equipment already dealt with. It wouldn't feature in the P&L anyway. And then the college fees, we've dealt with that in our general expenses working. So at that stage you're good to go. You can total that up. So you're coming along and you're saying, right, that's my total for my expenses then. Coming in here. Again, remember, always with your calculator on the day. Don't take any chances. And again, we don't know this figure. So I'm just highlighting now. Obviously, you don't need to highlight that when you're doing it, but I'm going to mark them in. Then we deal with any other income we might have. Other income, operating income, so if there was discounts, anything like that. So again, there may or may not be in a question. So you go back through it, and because of the way we're going to lay out our workings, we're not going to miss anything here. So there's nothing in the first part of that, and then we see our interest earned, 75. So that needs to go in, and then we don't have anything else there. So very simple, 75 being added on there. Investment interest. You'll come along, you'll add that on to this figure, and again we have another unknown figure. So think about what happens next. Normally if we had dividends or anything like that, they would be subtracted in the question 1. In an incomplete, you're not really going to have anything like that. You know, they'll have to make it very clear in the working if you do. So at this stage we're ready to label these, and we can say, so that is our retained earnings for the year. We have a P&L balance, 31st of 12, 2002. And we can go straight to that P&L balance because we don't have anything from the start of the year. The question doesn't tell us that there was profit transferred from last year or anything like that. So that P&L balance is going to come from up here, the 60992. So that retained earnings figure is actually that P&L balance. So 60992. Now let's think about this again. How do we get back to our sales figure? So we need to work backwards through the account. So we ended up with 60,992 after we added on €75. So to reverse that, I'm going to say 60992 minus the 75. And I see that I must have had a profit here of 60917. I added on 75 and I ended up with 60,992. How did I get to that 60,917? I got to it after I subtracted, after I subtracted the full expenses of 115,447. So I'm reversing that. 60917, add back on the 115,445. So that's my gross profit. If it was a minus, we'd call it a gross loss. So how do we get to the next part then? How do we figure out what the cost of sales figure is and what the sales figure is? So you need to go back to the question, and this is where you need to be really familiar and well practiced on the questions. They've told us in the question that the gross profit was 40% of sales. So the gross profit is 40% of the sales figure. So our sales figure is going to be 100%. So if 40% is equal to 176,362, 100%, what is that going to be equal to? So we take our 176,362 and divide it by 0.4. So our sales figure is 440,905, and now we can work out the rest. So 440,905, subtract your cost of sales, you get 176,362. So So I can subtract and figure out what the cost of sales was. 264,543. I get that cost of sales figure after I take away my closing stock. So add it back on to find out what it had been before it. I got the 28,174.32 after I added this figure onto the opening stock. So again, you do the opposite to figure out what the purchases after drawings were, and then to figure out what the purchases before drawings were, take your 265,043 and add back on the 5,200. So that's the method on it, and it's a little bit tricky at first, but what you do is you think you're going in reverse, and you can always check that your figures are right, because if you go down through the question as normal, then 440,905 subtract 264,543, do you get the 176,362? Does it hold true all the way down? And that's your way of checking that you have your addition and subtraction correct. A little bit trickier than the incomplete A in terms of you're working backwards up through it, but a lot of the same workings.